So this week we're talking about an essay called Annihilation by Stephen Luper-Foy, and the first thing I would say is that I don't plan on doing a multi-video analysis or interpretation of this essay, and that's not because it doesn't deserve it, or that it doesn't have some things that perhaps need to be interpreted. It's just that I think that given what this essay is, which is really a kind of an attack on Epicurus, and on really an attack on Epicureanism, what the author takes Epicurus to have implied as a philosophy, I don't feel a lot of sympathy with it right now. So I think that I'm at least in the kind of a mood where I feel like I would have to defend Epicurus against every one of Luper-Foy's criticisms, and we're going to be reading an essay next week that is a response to Luper-Foy in defense of Epicurus. So why don't we leave that defense until next week, and really get to the heart of what the serious point is here that Luper-Foy is making. First of all, it seems to me that the title of the essay is not really very helpful, because it's not an analysis of what annihilation is at all. Which is, I think, a very interesting topic in itself. But it's not that. It is a criticism, a thorough, sort of scorching criticism of Epicureanism in general, and trying to show that the Epicurean notion that death is nothing to us is fairly absurd. That, and on that basis, really meaning that a normal person who has the usual complement of hopes and desires and taking pleasure in life couldn't possibly hold the Epicurean idea that death is nothing to us. I think that along with all of the authors that we're reading in this particular book, in this collection, that they would agree that with Epicurus that death is the annihilation of the person. That is, none of these authors seriously hold to any sort of theory of immortality, any theory that death is not the absolute end for the person. That is, that death is the annihilation of the entire person. It's not just the death of the obvious end of the body or end of the living body, but it's the end of the living person in general. He has no issue with that. His issue is whether the prospect of that annihilation should be nothing to us. And like a lot of other authors that we read, he has a problem with that. It's quite obvious what his strategy is to undermine that Epicurean notion, and that is thinking that, or saying that death is a misfortune. But why is it a misfortune? Again, not because it causes positive suffering on the part of the person who dies. Again, anyone who holds to the idea that death is the total end of the person, the so-called annihilation, can't really hold that. But that death is a misfortune, as he says in the bottom of page 270, that it's a misfortune for us because it thwarts our desires. He says that on page 271, it seems reasonable to say then that whatever prevents me from getting what I want is a misfortune for me. I think that we can, the rest of the essay in a way writes itself. I mean, I do want you to, we'll provide study questions that will direct you to some of the details. But that once we characterize a misfortune in general in those terms as something which prevents me from getting what I want, I think we're familiar with the idea that death is just such an event. That is, there are things that we want in the future that we die before we get them. The death can be said in at least some of the cases, some of those things, the reason that we didn't get them because we died. And if we didn't get them because we died, then death is a misfortune because it prevented us from getting what we want. And then he goes into a number of different desires. For one example being what he characterizes as independent wants, and those he characterizes things that we want to happen in the future that we don't directly control. For instance, I may say that I want, he says, for the Earth to continue revolving around the sun, but that is a desire, the outcome of which, the object of which is independent of anything that I could do, that we could hold to those sort of desires and say that death doesn't thwart them. We could hold to a number of other types of desires, so-called, conditional desires, where I want something on the condition that I will be alive at a certain time. Those are those kind of desires. We can say that they're not thwarted by death. But the normal everyday conditional desires, or unconditional desires, I want this or that thing, and that death really could be said to prevent me from getting this or that thing, to Luper-Foy's mind is an obvious reason for calling death a misfortune, because it thwarts our desires. It prevents us from getting what we want, and there are other things that we would definitely characterize as misfortunes just because they thwart our desires. Now, the obvious comeback, I think, from the part of the Epicurean would be that it may be quite true that an event, say death or something else less drastic, does prevent me from realizing one or more desires that I have, but there is the problem of minding that thwarting, just as when we came across the idea that death was a misfortune because it deprives us of goods, which is very similar. There was the Epicurean comeback that, well, we can certainly be deprived of something by death in a certain way, but the problem is that we're not around to mind that deprivation, and if you don't mind something, that is, if you're not worried by it, bothered by it, made unhappy by it, there is a real question about whether it is can be said to be something bad for you if you don't suffer because of it in any way. He deals with that, I think, at least indirectly on page 274 when he says, "But isn't it a tragedy that death deprives us even of the opportunity to experience to delight and to regret?" That is, that it is the case that death takes away the possibility of minding death, minding the thwarting of our desires, but isn't that itself, that taking away of our capacity to mind, a kind of tragedy? Well, that's a rhetorical question. I don't know if it's a tragedy or not. I don't think it's obvious that it's a tragedy. It may be a kind of a tragedy. I don't know. But yes, this essay does really take the Epicurean to task, at least what he takes to be the Epicurean. I think that we have come across much more sympathetic readings of Epicurus, and not just with people who would be called Epicureans, thinking of McMahon in Death and the Value of Life, where he's talking about the existence requirement and pursue something called the reconciliation strategy, which I found to be very reasonable, and that was the idea that Epicurus was right, that we have to exist in order for a thing to be bad for us. But what he was interested in doing was then reconciling that belief or that principle with our common sense beliefs that killing is wrong, suicide can be irrational, etc. And I think that the key there was seeing that continuing to live can be a good thing for us, without dying being a bad thing for us. Now, whether that, then on the face of it, seems to be a contradiction, but I think that there's a way of formulating it. It's not. So I think that there are other more sympathetic and frankly richer readings of Epicurus than the one that Luper-Foy offers. But that's for you to decide, and you're in a position where you can read an essay like this without, I think, a lot of help by now. I will write some study questions that will ask you some more specific questions, but again, we'll wait for the comeback until next week when we read an essay that's specifically directed as a response to this one.